Good morning and welcome everyone to this first edition of Phi Sessions 2021. We are so pleased to have you all in this virtual room with us, and we look forward to sharing together today and into the future. My name is Cheryl Sim, Managing Director and Curator at the Phi Foundation for Contemporary Art, one of the entities that make up the Phi set of cultural institutions. Let's begin by acknowledging that Phi is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which Phi resides today. Tiohtià:ke, Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Tiohtià:ke Montreal community. On behalf of Phi's founder and director, Phoebe Greenberg, my co-lead for this event, Talia Dorsey, as well as the dream team of Phi colleagues who have all helped make this event a reality, we warmly welcome you to this space we will hold together to explore the potential of the cultural institution within our rapidly evolving contemporary context. Our intent is to launch and foster a collective project to explore and gather a range of voices concerned with the arts and culture milieu through open conversation and speculative interrogation. Underpinning the event are two foundational questions: understanding that art and culture are essential to our social fabric and collective well-being. What are the emerging roles for cultural institutions to reassert their own essential-ness in support of this fundamental dimension of everyday life? The other question is, how can institutions ensure the sustained capacity to play these roles? And conversely, how might these roles contribute to broader sustainability priorities and social progress? Phi Sessions 21 is conceived to be generative and evolutive. The content generated through the event's first day, today, of conversations will fuel the work sessions that will comprise day 2 of the event, which is going to happen on December 10th, all of which will inform and become elemental to a subsequent digital publication and possible print publication. Today features 3 sets of conversations. We'll begin this morning with the grounding sessions hosted by Ken Lum. And this afternoon, we will have 2 deep dive panels that will pick up on and delve into some of the key areas of inquiry raised in the grounding sessions. And the day will end with a summary session facilitated by myself and Talia. And during the summary session, we'll do a quick overview of some of the critical research subjects that emerged through today's conversations in order to provide some departure points for the working sessions on day 2. Now, each session today will be followed by 30 minutes for us to open the conversation to the whole forum. So you're encouraged to put forth comments in the Q&A, comments in the chat, and to add your questions to the Q&A window. And if you're interested in posing a question directly, perhaps let me know or put it in the Q&A window as well. Today, we are also pleased to offer live audio translation in French, ASL interpretation for the deep dive sessions, and QSL interpretation throughout all sessions today. Many thanks to our wonderful interpreters for assisting us. So without further ado, we're going to turn to our first set of conversations today, which are called the grounding sessions with the subtitle, Where Are We Now? Unfortunately, Rebecca Belmore is not able to join us this morning. So what we've arranged to have happen is that Yasomi Umoru is going to join us for a 30-minute conversation, followed by András, who will also participate in a 30-minute conversation with Ken Lum. And we will have our 30-minute Q&A session at 11:15 as scheduled. We're very sorry for that, and we hope Rebecca's feeling better soon. I'm very pleased to introduce the host of these one-on-one conversations. Ken Lum is an artist who has participated in numerous major exhibitions, including Documenta and the Venice Biennial. He is the chair of fine arts at the University of Pennsylvania's Weitzman School of Design in Philadelphia, a writer whose book, Everything is Relevant, was published in 2020. He's the curator of large-scale projects, including Shanghai Modern, 1919 to 1945, as well as co-founder and senior curatorial advisor to Monument Lab, a public and history collective founded in Philadelphia in 2012. His inquisitive and critical mind, combined with the multiple perspectives and experiences he has acquired over the course of his work, have made him a very experienced interlocutor for panels, and we are incredibly honored to have him host this morning's grounding sessions. Now, joining Ken for this first conversation is Yasomi Umoru. So Yasomi Umoru is an arts leader and contemporary curator. She is currently Director of Curatorial Affairs and Public Practice at Serpentine, London.
Okay.
She was previously Director and Curator, Logan Center Exhibitions at the University of Chicago, where she also taught courses in visual art and spatial practices as a lecturer in the Humanities Division. Prior to joining the Logan, Umolu held curatorial positions at the MSU Broad Museum, East Lansing, Michigan, Walker Art Center, Minneapolis, and Manifesta 8, the European Biennial of Contemporary Art. As artistic director of the 2019 Chicago Architecture Biennial, Umolu oversaw a critically acclaimed curatorial program featuring new commissions, off-site installations, and a host of performances, talks, workshops, and community engagements with over 80 international contributors. Umolu is a 2016 recipient of the prestigious Andy Warhol Foundation for Visual Arts Curatorial Fellowship. She served on the Curatorial Advisory Board for the United States Pavilion at the 16th Venice Architecture Biennial, and she is a trustee of the Graham Foundation for Advanced Studies in the Fine Arts, Chicago. So we'll just give her a minute to join us. I will speak with Ken here. Ken, how are you?
Good.
It's good to have you. Thank you so much for agreeing to host these conversations. As you know, cultural institutions are facing a lot of very emergent and evaluative questions. And I think we would both agree that these are questions that have deep roots, and it behooves us, it compels us to be able to address them in really meaningful and long-term ways.
I agree. I mean, these questions are not new for a certain important segment of the population. The people who are marked by difference, alterity. They have known these questions in embodied, lived ways for many years, in fact, decades, right? I think back to a book I read, autobiography of Abner Chandra in the 1960s, British artist, and how he talked about the difficulties of being brown-skinned in white London, making art, and the expectations that were quite untenable for him. On the one hand, he couldn't be as good as some of his white peers, and then on the other hand, he needed to replay the tropes of his brown-skinnedness and so on. So I think those questions are being. I see Yesomi here now, but I see those questions have been asked for a very, very long time, and it's about time that other people have also been asking them.
Agreed. On that note, then I'll let you to it. Thank you, Yesomi, for joining us, and please.
Sure. Hi, Yesomi.
Hi, how are you? Sorry about the delay.
Yeah, no problem. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. A little closer to you guys now. I'm currently in Minneapolis, so in the sort of same time zone.
Right. I wanted to just start by just asking how you are during these pandemic times, and you can interpret it any way you want. But I guess I'm thinking more in terms of self-care and also implications for others who may not have the same abilities to self-care and so on.
Yeah, well, thanks for that question. I think it's definitely one that we're probably all asking ourselves, and we've probably learned during the last year and a half or so to do those self-check-ins a little bit more. And of course, I think this was brought into sharp relief by the time that we all spent in lockdown in early 2020, and just kind of, I think, maybe facing the realities of lockdown and what it meant for our individual lives, but also our sense of, collectivity, whether that's connected to friends, family, or society at large. And through that process, I think that we've grappled with a lot of probably home truths, both in terms of like how we are managing our personal lives and affairs, and then how we connect to work and, the broader society. And so the pandemic, I think, has been a really important moment for us to do that self-check-in, those self-reflections, and have really brought the questions of care to the fore. In terms of how I'm personally doing, I think given everything and all the challenges of the last year and a half or so, I'm very grateful and thankful to still be here to have this conversation with you guys, to be able to be in a profession that I was in prior to the pandemic. I've been fortunate enough not to be severely affected by all the waves of redundancies and other challenges within the workplace, and to have also a family, and grateful for my young toddler who's 2.5, and my husband, and bigger kind of connections to my family as well. So yeah, I think it's really an important moment, and I think we're here now at the end of 2021, and we're still not over the the challenges. Obviously, the COVID pandemic is still ongoing, and everything else that has happened in and around this moment. Whether we think about sort of the reckoning around racial politics, the economic factor, how we're thinking about work-life balance, all of those things are still, up for further discussion and further attention, I think, in the next year or so, and potentially ongoing into the future.
Yeah, and I've also, I think it behooves everyone to kind of rediscover and ask themselves the questions of what's important in their lives. And I guess my second question to you is, how has art shifted in terms of that significance for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting, I think. My insertion into the art world and curatorial practice was always from a position of being with others and really thinking about museums as my primary space of social interactions. And this started very early on, in my life, before I even imagined what it meant to be a curator. So not having the proximity to not only museums and galleries, but also the wealth of interactions and relationships that they foster during the last year and a half or so has been very, very difficult, because that's really where art is activated for me, not necessarily solely in a sort of like individual contemplation of the artwork, but in a broader, social context. So that's been challenging, but I think we're sort of back, at least at my current role at Surf and Time, where I oversee the curatorial program. We're sort of back in terms of our activities, trying to get back into delivering the high quality exhibitions and programs and events and, civic engagement. So from that perspective, it's good to be returning to a sense of normalcy. But of course, I think as with any museum professional, we're still thinking about the question of our audiences and wondering whether or not they will kind of return to pre-pandemic, numbers. We're thinking about kind of the internal opening out of institutions that have happened over the last year and a half, and how we can do better with our structures, especially around questions of diversity, inclusion, and equity. So all of those things, I think, are in the matrix of how I see art and art practice and contemporary culture. And it's really been nice to return to connecting and having conversations with artists and thinking about how the pandemic has also affected them as practitioners.
Right, and you mentioned audience so many, and it's important to have audience, obviously, but I know that within the art world, the art audience is exploding worldwide. But at the same time as that number is enlarging, there has been a commensurate, crisis of confidence among a very large segment of the public that feels distant from art, right? Because art, right, and I don't entirely ascribe culpability to the art system, right? But I do think it poses a real problem in terms of whether art is able to touch a much wider constituency of people from which it draws a lot of its content for art as well. And just wondering your ideas for, or response to that problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think these questions are ongoing, and maybe we can think about them as a sort of continual loop of improvement within the context of museums, especially as we think about different publics and what that sort of transaction is between an institution and its public. I firmly believe that institutions have a role within broader civic society, and it's not the case that we should, barricade ourselves from the realities of the world beyond the museum walls, but actually we should be actively engaged with the world outside, because artists do that. They live in the context of a broader society, whether or not they choose to retreat from it on occasion to work solely in the studio, to form collectives and different affinity groups, or to kind of do a larger form of engagement with communities. So museums have to sort of reflect the plurality of artistic practice and its engagement beyond the sort of the white cube, as it were. And so I think I'm a firm believer in that, and I feel strongly that that should be, at least for me, centered in my practice. And I think more and more institutions are coming to recognize that it's of extreme import, that it's not the case that museums should solely be sort of repositories of, objects, but that there should be a variety of ways to engage in them. And the only way that we do that is having a variety of perspectives represented within institutions, not only in the sphere of curatorial, but visitor services, audience development, comms, et cetera, and et cetera. So I think what we want to get to is not to say that we're subsuming, an existing idea of what a museum is and being this sort of exclusive zone for contemplation of the art object. That's not the case at all. We're not subsuming that, but we want to add to that. We want to diversify it and we want to open it up. And I think if we are able to do that, then we have more pathways to connect to publics and to audiences. And I think these conversations are, as I said, is sort of a continuum. If we think back to the cultural wars of the 80s and 90s and the politics around, who is represented and which stories are represented, which type of practitioners have a voice within institutions, to the present day. These are conversations that seem very familiar. Sometimes it's maybe rather a bit disappointing that they seem also familiar, but I do believe that there's been some progress made and we need to continue down that line of improvement.
Right, I don't disagree with you, Somi. I mean, I agree with you in terms of opening up greater pathways. At the same time, I personally was a little bit, I feel great ambivalence in terms of even being in the art system at times, not all the time, but at times because of its distance, I would say, from the real world, right? I mean, if we pull back the lens and look at the art world, we do see, ultimately it is lubricated as an instrument of a finance as well. It's not just that we love art. I love art, but at the same time, it is configured within the system where we have Miami Basel, which is going on right now, and even in today's Washington Post, the header article was at Miami Art Basel, a canvas of global inequality in the pandemic age. Now, on the one hand, that may seem cartoonish, but then on the other hand, if the lens is pulled back, it's actually not untrue either. So, I guess I agree with you in terms of the pathways, but I guess the question I have in my mind is, which I'm posing to you, is the larger question of should the whole art system just be reformed, or can it be reformed?
Well, I mean, I think there are multiple art worlds, and the art worlds that we are most aware of, obviously, there's the market, there's the art worlds of museums and institutions, but I'm fairly certain that there are other art worlds and art worlds that, play a very crucial role to local ecosystems and, geographical ecosystems, or even, communities and neighborhoods. And those, I think we should equally acknowledge as being present and active, even if it seems that other art worlds, have the lion's share of attention directed towards them. I wasn't at Miami Basel this week, unfortunately, but I mean, I have been to other art fairs, and I think as a curator who believes in institutions and their civic role, it's also to understand that we sit within a broader ecosystem of which, galleries and for-profit entities, as well as non-for-profit entities, make the ecosystem work and hopefully richer, and hopefully work in a way that can benefit artists and art practices, but also benefit audiences as well. So I think that I understand your kind of skepticism and maybe your, as you say, ambivalence around art world, maybe with all caps, the art world, if you want to say the art world that we probably all think we know and recognize. But I guess I want to be an advocate for, other constellations of art worlds. And really, I hope through my work and my practice is to sort of like shine a light on that and make that more visible.
Well, I've done projects all around the world, much of it not having to do with my own art, but curatorial or even researching, for example, Oku and Wazer's Short Century exhibition. And so I was based in West Africa, and I did all kinds of projects. So I have tried to explore the so-called peripheries from the perspective of the so-called center. Of the art system, let's say, right, to try to find out more about art. I find that at those areas, those different geographies, or at least for me, I resuscitated my belief in art, right? At the same time as my ambivalence about the center remains, right? So I hear you there. In terms of what do you make of all these institutions today? And I'm sure perhaps the Serpentine as well has made all kinds of statements about a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion as a moral imperative. And is that just symbolism, or is that substance? And I can well imagine that from the perspective or from the subject position of artists of color who's been marginalized and over many decades, even centuries now, they might be, their skepticism might be much stronger. Let's say, what do you think of that in terms of, is it symbolism, or is it by and large, or do you think it's meaningful?
Well, I mean, some of you may be aware that I wrote a piece on ArtNet that was reflecting exactly upon this. And I think that I've said that in all other forums that piece really came out of me through, I guess, maybe a certain level of discontent in thinking about how museums are responding to, the ongoing, murders of Black and brown people within the US context and beyond, especially obviously brought to the fore by the murder of George Floyd. And being a sort of external observer while also being in institutions and seeing what the kind of language was or the rhetoric was around responding to this very, very kind of critical moment, I think, which is, I think, unfortunately, is going to be a historic one. I think we're going to think about 2020 and the murder of George Floyd alongside other sort of historical events that have really turned or kind of enabled us to rethink questions around race and violence and equality and inclusion. And so I think that was, for me, like a very public articulation of that discontent. And it was never intended to garner as much sort of attention and interest as it has thus far. But I'm sort of glad that it did, because it feels like I might have sort of articulated an opinion, discontent, a perspective that was shared by a lot of people within the arts and cultural field. And these are people that cross, I think, different cultural and racial backgrounds in terms of wanting our institutions to do better, in terms of how they respond to the politics of the now, but also how they kind of think about their own implication in forms of violence and forms of exclusion. And I think that having worked through this period and talked to colleagues, and as everyone else seen, as I said, institutions turn themselves inside out, I think that there is a reality to this moment. I think that it's been felt at all levels of institutions, and especially at the level of leadership and the board level, that there does need to be change. And that change cannot be a cursory one. It cannot be one that is just sort of pandering to the current zeitgeist, but one that has to be longstanding and effective, so that institutions can be more responsible in their civic role. And so I think it's a real moment. I think it's a real moment of reckoning. I think that a number of institutions have faced things really head on, and we have seen the challenges of the moment, the challenges of not being able to respond in the right way, played out publicly. And we've learned from those, or the myriad of different, the fallout of the myriad of different activities and events around, 2020. And I'm in an institution now, and I'm in a position of leadership, and we have ongoing conversations around race resolutions. And at times they're frustrating, and at times they're incredibly kind of promising and encouraging. And I think we're in this moment of slight contradiction, where we know the direction we need to head in, but there is quite a lot to do to prepare the way to get us there. And that's what we're doing now. We're sort of working through it. And it's been, I think that everyone who works in institutions without the pandemic, everything that's happened, it's been tough. It's been a real challenge. The mental health implications on staff and everyone. It's quite a bit. But I again continue to think that to believe in institutions and to believe in their capacities to evolve and to change, and hopefully the more and more we can kind of move the needle, the more we have more people on board where the agenda is set right from the outset, and it's not something that we look back in a hindsight and say, oh, we wish we had sort of could have previewed this before it happened.
Right. I was just saying to Cheryl Sim, just prior to you coming on, Somi, that these questions that it seems everyone's asking now, and which is a good thing, obviously, has been asked by people of color, people of difference for a long time. Even I said decades, but I think you can go even centuries now. People of color who were artists last century or the century even before that were making certain demands and were imagined in return, which were containers in terms of even their mobility to advance in the art system. So, coupled with the fact that modern art itself, the legacy of art itself, was born out of not a small modicum of racism as well, right? The entire terms of it has been deeply leavened by patriarchy and white maleness and so on. So, and of course, most collections are no matter how brilliant, are consequent of that legacy as well. And it continues to be lubricated by wealthy, or inordinately, I would say, not entirely, but inordinately by hedge fund collectors and things like that. Some of them, because I work at an Ivy League university, I actually know and even enjoy the company of, right? But I'm not, I can still say that it is a kind of a problem of democracy within the art system. I wanted to just bring up something that happened only last night at the university. There's a lecture by a Native American collective named Post Commodity, and they came up with, they were quite fiery, which I enjoy, and made a statement about quite bold about how all cultural institutions are founded on racism, and they continue to propagate racism no matter what we tend to believe in, and that they needed really to be radically reformed. And so I guess that is somewhat at odds in terms of your comment that you believe in the continuity of the museums, and so I guess my question is, how do you reconcile the two, or can it be reconciled, or is it just a difference of opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I think that maybe just to clarify, I think I believe in institutions. I believe in cultural institutions, and their abilities to represent not only arts and culture, but politics, economics, philosophy, everything over and beyond that. And I believe that institutions, have a role to play in civic society. Now, whether or not, how do we think about continuity in relation to that, I think is a big question. And maybe I can give an example of an experience that I had when I was curating the Chicago Architecture Biennial in 2019, which, as it would happen, seemed to have preempted in some of the questions that we were asking and the themes that we were going to preempted the 2020 moment in some ways. But as part of that trip, we went on as part of that biennial, we went on a trip to South Africa. And this was a moment just after the sort of waves of student uprising that were happening, a sort of decolonized movement, especially within university settings, by young indigenous South Africans who are part of, I guess, a generation that one would call the born free generation, who might not necessarily have lived under the apartheid system, but certainly have had to live with its legacies in their lives, especially in terms of access to education, which forms of knowledge are privileged, who can study what, how and why, what public spaces look like in institutions. And visiting South Africa at that moment was really kind of, I guess, for us as a curatorial team, a really crucial kind of experience to think about the sort of challenges of how does one rebuild, in a post situation, in the post-apartheid situation, how do you really rebuild? And is it really about what would happen if, as the sort of decolonized movement and the young student groups were asking for, was a complete sort of eradication of existing systems and ways of working, and a rebuilding through a new perspective, through kind of a new generation's understanding of themselves, and a sort of older generation of South Africans who have fought for the freedoms that the younger generation enjoyed, have fought for their right to speech, to free speech, and understood what it meant for them to be able to have some continuity in order to get them into that post situation. And so you have this sort of generational kind of like splinter, and having experienced that, one could see the case for both. One could understand why an older generation would want continuity because they understand the chaos of complete breakdown. And then could understand the reason why a younger generation would want a complete reset because of the burdens of, the apartheid era. And so I think we have to really hold those two things as being true. Maybe they're two sides of the same coin, and we have to manage and hold them at the same time. And in a similar way as we think about institutions and how we can kind of move past this moment, where do we have the opportunity to completely dismantle and rebuild? And where do we have the opportunity to kind of maintain a certain level of continuity? I think things have to go hand in hand, and we have to find a way to sort of balance it out. And so I understand the more sort of like radical perspective, and definitely feel like it has it has a place and a role. But I also understand the perspective that might want change to be more slow, and to kind of be shaped differently. And I think that's where we're at right now. And I think the key is that we have all these voices represented, and that there is space to kind of articulate a view, and that maybe at some point we sort of come instead of seeing it as sort of diverging perspectives, we think of it as maybe perspectives that will converge at some point and then lead to the sort of radical change that I think we all want to see, regardless of whether or not we think that, it should happen now or, in 10, 20, 30 years time.
Thank you, Sylvia. I was going to ask another question, but I think your last comments were so lucid and in capturing of the contradictions, you might say, that has to be negotiated simultaneously in this very challenging but also opportune time that we are in. I very much appreciate meeting you virtually even, and getting to know you and your thoughts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ken and Yesomi, for starting off with this already very rich and critical discussion. And a very heartfelt thanks to you, Yesomi, for being so agile and joining us earlier than scheduled. We really do appreciate that. And hopefully, Yesomi, you'll come back for the Q&A at 11:15. Our next guest to engage in conversation with Ken Lum as part of this morning's grounding sessions is András Szántó. András is a widely published author who advises museums, foundations, educational institutions, and corporations on cultural strategy and program development worldwide. He earned his PhD in sociology from Columbia University, and his writings have appeared in the New York Times, Art Forum, ArtNet, and the Art Newspaper, among other publications. As consultant, he advises some of the world's leading cultural institutions and corporate art programs. He has lectured on art business at the Sotheby's Institute of Art and has directed the National Arts Journalism Program at Columbia University. Welcome, András.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'm here from the belly of the beast. I'm actually at Art Basel, Miami Beach. So plenty of those billionaires running around behind me. Good morning.
Hi, András. Good meeting you again.
Very good to see you.
How has the pandemic changed your view of art, or even what counsel you offer to others about art?
I must say, having just spent the week here, I'm not sure it has changed as much as we'd like to think. We all know that one's view of history is never very clear in the fog of war, as it were. So I think we tend to overstate the amount of change when we're in the midst of it. Things eventually settle down. I'm not saying that there aren't long-lasting changes. There are many. It's an exhilarating and exciting time, but legacy institutions and established ways of working do have a way of reasserting themselves. So I think it's going to take us a long time to truly see what the outcomes are. But there's no question. I've been spending the whole week here with museum directors and all kinds of institutional representatives, from both the commercial and the non-commercial side. This has been a cataclysmic time. Last year, I wrote a book on the future of art museums, and the key message of which was that it's not necessarily that the changes we're seeing now have come out of the blue. Many of the changes in the field, and I'm particularly talking about museums, were already gestating, but the pandemic has been a kind of catalyst that has accelerated many of the changes that, frankly, the field was talking about, but which in the sort of frenzy of cultural production didn't always happen. So I think that the overall experience of the pandemic was a series of seismic shocks, particularly heavy ones for museums. Obviously, the health emergency itself, which has required extraordinarily complex institutional adaptations, the economic fallout of essentially walking away from your business model, which is very much show business. You have ticketed audiences and the money they leave behind. But perhaps most importantly for the field and most lastingly, as already I can see has been discussed here, this sort of very deep-seated reckoning over systemic inequities and racial justice, which began, after the death of murder of George Floyd. But one thing I would say beyond that, and which I think explains the very deep anxiety that we feel in many cultural institutions, is that during the pandemic, they have to confront something that perhaps in normal times they wouldn't have seen. As you know, museums, I think this is true in Canada, were not declared essential institutions. I think that the field very much had a sense of itself as being, pillar institutions of society, being essential to the communities in which they operate. And yet, hardware stores were open, museums were closed, churches were open, museums were closed. And that, in a way, I think has been particularly a bitter pill to swallow, that clearly in the eyes of decision makers, museums were not seen as so essential as to warrant keeping open in the middle of this health crisis. And that seems to be a very tough verdict on the degree to which they have actually lived up to their own promise to be relevant to people's lives. So I think that insight is driving a lot of the action right now, really truly getting these institutions, which actually internally thought they were democratic, to really truly open up. And that agenda, which we can talk about, is a very complex, multifaceted agenda, which is really accelerated in recent months. So I think one last thought is I actually did a panel here myself last week with 3 newly installed museum directors, all women, which is really a very positive panel, because the feeling was that, it's been a heck of a year, but there's an opportunity now to reimagine the institution, to reaffirm the relevance of the institution, and to sort of change the rules of the game so that we really bring this, 2-century-old model in line with the 21st century.
Right, and we can say that we had a preamble discussion last week, briefly on Zoom, András, which I enjoyed very much. But these questions have been not just posed by people of color, artists of color and difference, for a very, very long time, but they pose it as embodiment. They pose it as lived experience, which is, of course, dimensionally of a different order than simply a kind of academic question, or even a kind of a question in terms of public administration of a museum, even for the best reasons. And so this point of self-examination by museums that's undergoing some substantive width in today's context, I guess those artists, and I count myself somewhat in that camp, can be forgiven for for, I guess, having a deeper skepticism about
Yes. Well, I mean,
institutions.
sorry to cut you off.
Sure.
Yes, I think that for most artists, skepticism about museum is sort of the default mode of many artists, because for as long as museums have existed, and let's not forget, the idea of museums even being involved in the life of contemporary culture is a relatively new one, even newer than the museum, which itself is, not a very old institution, a couple of centuries really. But this, there's always been this interesting tension of to what extent the museum should even acknowledge contemporary expressions. But even the ones that did, always managed to let the expectations of the artists in their own backyard down. So one of the things we often see, of course, and you see this, I think, in Canada, is that museums want to play to an international art world relevance, the truly big ones. They want to be seen in the sort of A-list of international institutions. And that creates a kind of town and gown dynamic immediately, because the local community wants the museum to be a showcase for and a platform for all the diversity and energy in that community. But the museum often is more interested in bringing in, your Jeff Koonses and whatnot. And that's always been a strained and difficult relationship, right? So I think that, somebody said the other day, the museum started out being about art, and it's ended up being about art history. And it was supposed to be to show art and artists, but the prerogatives of professional art history sort of took over. And it's become more theoretical and much more driven by people coming out of certain, fairly privileged circumstances, in far more homogenous than I think they ever really thought they were, although it didn't take much to look at how homogeneous museum staffs have been. Of course, I think outside the museum, a lot of that awareness was present. What was very interesting, I think, in this last year is that it's not just that this awareness became actualized in institutions and, at the board level, at the staff level, but in fact, in many cases, the staff of the institution, and I'm particularly talking about younger staff and staff members representing a more diverse social backgrounds, drove that conversation in ways that were often quite, jarring and difficult. It was sort of, what to even compare it to, but it was a moment of candor that we hadn't seen before, and a kind of release of many of the energies. One part of which is that there are now channels to, communication channels for these viewpoints to be expressed. There's quite a few websites and social media platforms where people can share their experiences of lived racism, sexism, ageism around museums. So things that used to be sort of swept under the rug are suddenly much more out in the open. And I think we have to acknowledge that this is part of a larger story. This is the part of a story of, as it were, legitimacy crisis for all institutions. I think that every institution is making a journey from being a kind of top-down institution that seems to be governed by a fairly clear set of cultural understandings about its purposes, to a much more open institution, which needs to respond to this diversity, of the true diversity of its community. So I do think the museum has had a harder go at this than many others for two reasons. One is that museums have managed to, frankly, not open up at a time where many other kinds of institutions have opened up. There's still a sense of front stage and backstage in museum. Most people have no idea what goes on, how these shows come about, and so on. The other is that I think very few institutions claim to stand for the community in the way that the museum does, so that when it fails to live up to that, well, the emperor has no clothes. There's a lot to talk about.
Right, and I agree with that, and I also think even in terms of the question of diversity, which has been expanding in terms of the global constituency of artists of different geographies, different social classes, has become much more socially differentiated, you might say, in terms of the overall constellation of artists that participate in galleries and have opportunities to exhibit to a public. It still is somewhat based on consensus on a global level. What I mean by that is that, for example, just to take a kind of something that comes to mind, if I go to the MoMA in New York and see the collection, and then I go to another capital, say Paris, and go to the Centre Pompidou and see the collection, because that's where the Musée d'Art Moderne is, in the d'Art Contemporain in Paris is, right? I see that there's obviously a different interpretation, although much of it's still aligned, right? But it's a shift, right? And so that tells me that, and then the second thought related to that would be that, given the huge expanse of subject positions out there that could be transformed into art or art experiences and so on, the art world as a totality only captures a sliver of that broad width of potential art subjects. And so, that is also a kind of problem, because I'm very familiar with Asian museums, for example, and you start seeing, of course, there would be an accent on local artists or national artists and Asian artists, but there's no real challenge to the meta narrative of who are the most important artists, and everyone's kind of chasing the same narrative. Do you see that?
I completely agree with your points, although I do think that there's a lot of more than green shoots to celebrate in this respect. First of all, I do think that well before last year, the intellectual energy in the field was very much about, rendering more polyphonic the telling of art history. And for those who have had a chance to visit MoMA recently, the physical realignment of those galleries and the rehangs are truly a wonderful demonstration that even such a hegemonic, as it were, collection can be deployed in a completely different way, much more fluid, much more multidimensional way. And that couldn't have happened if there hadn't been years and years of work behind that, in terms of getting donors behind it, hiring curators. People underestimate how complex it is to make change in museums. It's easy to say, please be more diverse, but where are the works if the collection doesn't have them? Where's the money to buy those works? Where's the curatorial expertise to integrate those works? Where is the frankly, incredible logistical complexity of redoing a museum? It's sort of like rebuilding a plane in flight. So I do think that intellectually, that was where a lot of the excitement was, but now I think there's a much deeper, genuine appetite for that. And frankly, it's no longer possible. One of the areas we see it here in the US, of course, is in the really universal move to rehang American collections where they exist, where all of a sudden the perfectly obvious absence of the native voice, for example, in these collections, and the Black representation and many other representations suddenly felt completely unacceptable. And so you see it now all around the United States, and foundations, I think, are playing a very productive role in actually, supporting the actually very costly process of realigning these collections. So I think it's happening, but I want to say one other thing. We have to be aware that even as this happens, we are still a very small pond. We have outsized cultural influence, but the museum remains unfortunately still a relatively niche area. Contemporary art remains a very niche area. And I think that even as we reinterpret collections and exhibitions, what actually is going on is maybe something even bigger around the latest developments in digital expression. I met yesterday, I had lunch with a wonderful artist named Refik Anadol I don't know if you know his work, who's here in Miami Beach with a kind what he calls a data painting, which is entirely made of data, and it's a kinetic data visualization. And he was saying that he went out at 6 o'clock in the morning on the beach to take a picture of it, and 60 people showed up who are all part of these digital networks of art enthusiasts who have nothing to do with the mainstream art world. And indeed, we may, although there's a lot of disdain for a lot of these NFT works that we're seeing, because they're, they don't seem to be conforming to what we perceive or we think of as contemporary art. It may be another even larger paradigm shift where you're seeing new institutional infrastructure emerging around the galleries, museums, and art press that have defined, and academia that have defined the conversation around visual art. And we are seeing literally thousands of new artists of all kinds, some of them extraordinarily young, and collectors who are in their 20s, who have lots of cash, beginning to create almost like an alternate universe that, frankly, museums, they barely even know this exists. So there's a lot going on. And I think fundamentally, the questioning and the strain that we're putting institutions under will be generative. Museums have lived through many great social transformations, and I think this is one of them.
Well, I hope you're correct. I mean, in terms of MoMA, I remember seeing a show. I think it was 2 years ago, no, 3 years ago. It was before the pandemic, of called Concrete Utopias in Yugoslavia, which I thought was kind of an amazing show about socialist, fantasy architectural pavilions during the Tito regime, which was kind of an amazing show. And so that told me that even a dowager like the MoMA has the capacity to really kind of produce new knowledge or about very important areas that are known. At the same time, though, I also believe that MoMA will come up with another Picasso show, another Picasso Matisse debate show, and so on. So they hold on to this, this legacy.
Well, there's a lot of economic interest that drives that, of course. But interesting that you mentioned Yugoslavia. I myself grew up in Eastern Europe, in Hungary, so I know very well. I'm just one of many communities that have always felt that they were written out of art history. That's what I grew up with. Mm-hmm. We had our fantastic artists. You had the Cubists, you had Surrealists, you had the entire parallel art history that was entirely written out of the Western canon. That's what I've grown up with my whole life, which is closing in on, 5-6 decades. So I think we all have to be, keenly aware that the grievances or the sense of exclusion has always been with us. Art museums are far less elitist today and have been really since the 70s than they were previously, right? When they were royal collections and princely collections. But I think we've had a big opening and I think a self-awareness that this is the work that lies ahead. So that's why my main point that I'm trying to make is that in the field itself, this was not, a surprise. It's just that I think that in this last year, this really broke open in ways that are, I think, very, very positive. It's going to take time, obviously, for these changes to happen. In the book that I wrote, for example, we talked about gender imbalances in collections with one director. And of course, it's absurd to propose this, but she said that they'd done the numbers in her museum and calculated how many years of only collecting female artists. And I understand that even those categories are no longer as binary as they once seemed to be, erroneously. Nonetheless, it turned out that it would take something like 80 years to not buy a single work of art by a man until there was some gender parity in the collection. And that's just gender. Obviously, we have many, many versions of this. So institutions move slowly, and in their defense, I would say, I don't know if they need to be defended, that we have to also realize that they're trying hard, but people inside museums, they always make the analogy to this sort of super tanker. And the other thing I would say is that,
can I interrupt you there in terms, because you mentioned the super tanker analogy is kind of like what you said earlier about the fast moving airplane in the sky. And I wonder that seems to be a problem if that's the case, right? Which I don't disagree with you. I think it's probably an apt description of how museums see themselves, and it does provide a kind of convenient apologia for them to continue to move glacially.
Yeah, but I do think I think it's a very good point, and this need to speed up with change was actually something we discussed here with these museum directors as well. Mm-hmm. I agree with you. World is moving fast, and museums risk their relevance by not keeping pace with those changes. But I will posit this. I actually think that if you look at the programming of museums today, you walk into almost any museum, even here at Art Basel, if you walk through the fairs. I went through the Perez Art Museum in Miami yesterday. You will see enormous diversity, new voices, artists you've never seen before. I just went through a fabulous Africa show yesterday. I think when it comes to the pace of change, I'm referring especially to inside the museum. And I actually think that there's more turmoil happening behind the scenes in institutions than the visiting public would see just by visiting the museum. And here is where the slowness comes in, because true change requires new people in decision-making roles. And that doesn't happen overnight. Now, you have a different situation in Canada than we in the United States, but decision-making in the US Museum ultimately rests with the trustees. There is a great deal of homogeneity in trustee composition in the US. That's people, museum moving away from that. They're creating different categories of trustees, so you don't need 50,000 a year to be a trustee. We're seeing artists joining museum boards. This is all great, but again, it doesn't happen overnight. Then when you come down to the next level, museum directorships are also something that you do have to have the experience to have run parts of institutions to presumably to run a museum. I mean, it's not something you can just sort of switch on. And then really, I think one of the great issues is the lack of curatorial hiring in the past, where you have people in curatorial leadership roles and curatorial working roles who have a deep affinity to this material. Because again, to a degree that is rarely recognized, it's not just the collection. Let's say somebody were to donate hundreds of works that would help to rebalance the collection. You then need people inside the institution who know how to study and analyze and interpret and communicate those works. And the educational system, at least here in the US, is not producing a great many curators of color, for example. We certainly have no issues with gender. The entire field is far more female-driven today. I'm very happy that in my book, half the museum directors were women. But institutions are living organisms. You can't just grow new parts of them overnight. But I do think that many change processes have been initiated in recent months that simply were not there before. And you see it in the hiring, you see it in the announcements of who are the people who are getting major positions in museums. And I think that once those individuals are in decision-making positions, then you will start that change accelerating, seeing that change accelerating.
I agree with that. Those changes need to be done to include a diversity of not just people of color, but equally important, diversity of lived experiences, which is largely absent from the museum. And I do fault the pedagogical system, at least here in the United States, for that as well, because it is an elitist system and so on. I also agree that the art world is a kind of niche. It's very small. It has a kind of outsized projection in terms of in terms of public publicity and so on. Having said that, I also agree with bell hooks that the art system is also just one cog in an larger interlocking system of domination as well. So I think that also needs
well,
to be
I mean, we can, that's like, let's have another Zoom about that. I mean, I think actually one of the really difficult reckonings for many people working in the arts is that they felt that they were making career choices where they were the good guys. Like the one thing you felt like, maybe you didn't go, I don't know, into banking or whatever, or maybe your brother became the lawyer, but you went into the arts. And there was a sense that this was a good, that you're on the better sides of things. And I think it was truly disquieting for many people in leadership roles. And I know some who left those roles for that reason, to come face to face with the realization that these institutions, which they really felt and truly believed are doing this wonderful work, are at the same time perceived by so many as upholding the status quo that is unjust to so many people, that these institutions perhaps unwittingly are contributing to a system which they wouldn't agree with. And I think that's been on a personal level, and I know many of these people, I think it's been a very difficult thing to confront. I think it's true of, frankly, university educators as well, because there's not that much of a difference in the conversation we're having here about art institutions. Many of the things we have said, I think you could say about the university, and you are keenly aware of how these same strains and tensions have played out in universities as well as museums.
Well, one quick question, but if you can answer it kind of quickly, and this will be the last question I have.
That's very unusual for me, but I'll give it a try.
But I appreciate your kindness and your answers thus far. What is it for artists? Is there a benefit for artists what you do in terms of counseling large cultural institutions?
Me personally?
Yeah.
Well, I don't brag about it, but I have to say, a lot of the work that I have done, some of it is working with institutions, but actually a lot of it is also working with big companies that put together initiatives for artists, or art initiatives that almost always benefit artists, whether it's a residency program or an art prize or a commissioning program. And frankly, if you added up the sum of these programs, I would say they brought an enormous amount of opportunity to artists. So it's been a great satisfaction to me that I've been able to be a part of a process that has unlocked, frankly, a lot of resources for artists. I'll give you one example. 10 years ago, with the help of cigar companies, some people maybe wouldn't, have critical things to say, but we launched a Caribbean art initiative that for a while was providing extraordinary opportunities for Caribbean artists to see the world, to be seen by the world, and resources for institutions, publications, because it happened to make sense for the company. So I can give many other examples. Art writers also, I've created a program that supports art writers. So I think, rather than talking about me, I would say it is a very important and perceived priority in the philanthropic sector to actually go back to supporting artists and not just institutions. It goes back to me saying, it should be about the artists, not the latest art historical theories. It should be ultimately about the artists. And it's easy to lose side of that. And I personally, I feel like I've done my part to steer some resources to artists.
Thank you very much, András, for your transparency and your thoughtful, comprehensive answers to the question. They're very much appreciated. I look forward to one day meeting you in
Yeah,
person.
well, it'd be great, wouldn't it?
I've met a lot of people on Zoom.
Are we staying on for Q&As?
Sure. Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, indeed. Yeah, huge thanks to you both, Ken and András. This has been a very insightful and foundational conversation, and it's prompted some really excellent questions. Yesomi has rejoined us, and now we're going to widen the circle to the whole forum. And this is the time for us to share additional questions and comments, so you can enter those into the Q&A feature, and I'll help facilitate the process. Our first question, it's a two-parter, comes from Aquil Virani. He says, I'm wondering if you can talk about institutions' waning ability to position themselves as apolitical authorities. What changed? And the second question is, and how do we move cultural institutions past their class hierarchy blind spots? Open that to the panel. Thank you.
Would you like to go first, please? Or
That
Whoever
directed.
wants.
Oh, is that me?
yeah, yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think what changed is maybe a greater awareness of, the voices of others, and what they were saying with respect to museums and their politics. And I think we've seen this happen, as I think has been mentioned, this has been happening pre the pandemic. If we think about other movements really called for action within museums, whether it's around kind of climate consciousness and thinking about the implication of museums in, not very kind of like ecological endeavors by way of their associations to as companies, or questions around gender and representation, a myriad of other, issues that have been raised by us and by the public, to sort of force museums to kind of take a different position. I think this is happening continuously, and we can align, various artistic movements to the greater calls for accountability within museums. And I think we're just in another moment where there has been, I guess, a sort of deeper reflection and an acknowledgement of, the grave injustices within museums, and that a public that is being articulate, can call out museums. I think we can't underestimate the power of social media and the sort of way in which, discontent, questions that are leveraged at museums can spread like wildfire. And maybe the sort of threat to museums' credibility through that. I think that certainly we all witnessed that happening last year. A lot of this, reckoning was played out on our social media platforms. And I think that there is some level of reality hitting home that, there is a question about credibility and losing one's position if you don't attend to the needs of your publics. And so I think that's sort of what changed, and that's what sort of maybe made things more highlighted over the last year or so. In terms of class hierarchies, I think as within the work that everyone is doing right now around DEI, we have to acknowledge that there are other protected categories that have to be represented within institutions, and certainly class is one of those, alongside race, alongside gender, alongside sexuality, a myriad of other sort of protected categories. And I think the class one might be a very difficult one to uproot, because it does go back to what are the pathways for entering museums and museum work. First, as professionals, do you need a sort of formalized education to work as a museum director, as a museum curator, or even at a more junior level within an institution? And then likewise, what are the pathways for access within two institutions? I mean, within the American context, there's the question of paid attendance and how that balances out against kind of free admission. And I'm working in the UK now where we do have free admission. And, you know, there has been a sort of general kind of move over the last 10, 15 years to democratize the art system and to make museums more open to the public. But that has taken a huge mandate and resourcing from the government. And that needs to be mirrored in other ways in other institutions in terms of how do we really support museums to make sure that there is free access to all. And I think we still grapple with that on a day-to-day basis, that even if there is free admission, that does not mean that everyone feels a certain level of comfort to enter an institution and to participate and to feel that they would be acknowledged and their participation would be considered meaningful. So there are lots of different barriers to access that we have to work through. And again, it's about trying to kind of tackle them somewhat simultaneously and see how they are all connected to each other.
Beautifully stated. Thank you. I just add to your list of excluded categories. We have a project right now working with a foundation that aims to address the very much persistent issue of ageism. One of the persistent and unacknowledged exclusions, or however you want to call it, in our society is that older people are deemed no longer necessary, no longer supported, they're perceived to be somehow less able than others, and so on and so forth. 80% of education dollars flowing through museums go to people under 20. Now, there are reasons for that as well. But, you know, I think it's very important to understand that museums are challenged to address so many different inequities that it's truly difficult. But to the question of neutrality, there's no such thing as neutrality. Nobody ever believed that there was truly such a thing as neutrality. But I do think that there has been a desire among museums, I think, coming from a good place of staying out of the political debates of the day, particularly at a time when, certainly south of your border here in the US, society is almost irreparably divided and polarized, and museums are seeking to make themselves available to the full range of people. That is a very difficult thing to do. Nonetheless, I think many museums have recognized that they need to think of themselves as activist organizations because there's real change that requires to happen. And this once again means changing a lot of the professional norms and language that has been used around these institutions. But I will say this. One of the things I truly fear is that even in our, I think, very serious efforts to open up the museums to many communities, actually, this issue of who we speak to remains a very difficult one, particularly in the American heartland. Museums often are absolutely incapable of addressing audiences who are often much to the right of where their staffs are and where their decision makers are. So, you know, it's a real balancing act. And then to those who are so impatient with these institutions, I would say, come and work for them. You know, come and work for them, because it's very easy to cast aspersions from the outside in. It's much harder to make change from within.
I have a question here, a very good one from, excuse me, I'm mispronouncing the name, Seda Al Akres. He or she says, thank you for the conversation. The limits of EDI policies and action plans have been documented by many scholars as they essentially help institutions to remain in their status quo. And I'm interested in the tension between the hope these actions generate while also keeping, that they are interested in the tension between what these actions generate, but it also keeps whiteness in place. So in relationship to institutions, could we approach the idea of transformation by asking questions through prefigurative politics rather than starting with an EDI approach? Prefigurative, I guess, would allude to the futurity, future conditions.
I'm a little bit stumped by that, to be honest. I think what we all need to do more of, and this is what I tried to do in this book last year, the Future of the Museum, where I sat down with 28 museum directors, is to just really stop and imagine possible futures, and be open-minded. I mean, there are I believe quite strongly that, in fact, we are living in a moment when a much greater sort of sense of pluralism is setting in to what a museum can be. Basically, the model of the museum was a European inheritance that was then further evolved, mostly, in North America, in the United States. And actually, the most important dynamic institutionally that's happening is the globalization of museums. So for all of the debates we're having here, I think the most radical and interesting change is how museums are evolving in parts of the world where that didn't used to happen. I had a wonderful dinner 2 days ago with this incredible director of a museum in Togo, which is highly experimental, because when you're building a museum in Africa, you're going to have very different answers to what kind of structures you want, what kind of culture you're going to accommodate, how you're going to relate to your audience. This particular museum is also an arboretum and an educational center, but also has commercial aspects. So I think that we are actually living in a moment when the range of answers to what a museum can be is far wider than it has ever been. So I mean, there's sort of strategic planning and all that, and I do that for a living. But I actually think that, even above that, we need to think about it. I'm sure some of your guests are aware that the International Council on Museum has been engaged in an exercise to redefine, to literally write a new definition of the museum, which highly accentuates the museum's role in terms of social justice and support of communities and things that are beyond the museum's sort of traditional mandates around objects and interpretation and exhibitions and so forth. So I think that there's actually more going on than many people perceive, and clearly the survival, the sort of continuing evolution of this institution does depend on opening up imaginative space for what such an institution can be. I'm not sure that answered the question, but anyway.
I have another question here from Michelle Theriot. Goes, I would like to ask the panelists, either of you can answer or both, to address the question of the influence and power of private galleries, which are a real force in shaping not only museum programming and acquisitions, and I would even say they produce many more interesting shows than many museums today. So much of that today, many artists feel they will not get attention from our major institutions unless they are commercially represented, and not just by any gallery, but ones that are multinational, etc. Large institutions are generally not representative of the art being made now, reacting later than these smaller galleries, smaller institutions, and alternative ones, and artist-run spaces. So just to comment on that. Yesomi, you want to tackle that?
I mean, I think this is an interesting question to reflect on right now, especially as we are recovering from COVID, right? The financial impact of COVID. And I think that certainly museums are looking for more partnership, and to partner across the non-for-profit and for-profit sector. I think that actually that's a necessity right now because institutions cannot do the recovery alone. And as before, we have to kind of find the resources, where possible and where applicable for projects, whether or not those are collection projects or, an artist commission, or as was discussed, rethinking a sort of acquisitions process within the context of an institution. And I do think that that's the reality of our current moment. And obviously across, locations, the sort of power or impact of commercial galleries sort of shifts and changes in relation to what other forms of funding and support there are available to sustain institutions, but also to sustain artists. I know obviously somewhere like Canada has a very kind of engaged arts council that supports artists and supports museums. That's not the case in the US. We have to, rely on the private sector and sort of individuals and the corporate sector as well. And so I think it's up for discussion. And I think what's been interesting actually pre the pandemic, it was interesting to see how a lot of large scale galleries were becoming more museological. I think about the example of PACE, right? And sort of instituting curatorial roles, recruiting from sort of seasoned museum professionals and delivering programs that look and feel like museum level programs, and working with artists and states and placing works in major collections, et cetera, and et cetera. So I'm curious if that model of kind of the large scale private gallery come museum, how that's going to evolve post the pandemic, because of course the pressures of visitorship is not as huge on them, but they have other pressures, I guess, in relation to kind of sales and sustaining their role within the market. So I don't know, I'm sure András has more to kind of share on.
Well, I would say that, when I used to teach more, I envy you guys for doing more of that. I used to teach art business for people going into the sector, and literally the first class, I was always talking about hybridity, because I'm a sociologist, and what always struck me, really, I wrote my so what to me has always been interesting about the art world is this incredible seamless hybridity between the commercial energies and the institutional infrastructure, which has, I think, on balance, has helped to keep the visual arts much more in the foreground of contemporary cultural expression than other what used to be called high arts form. If you think about classical music, for example. So I think on balance, this has been a complex but a productive symbiosis. Second point I would make is, basically museums have been pushed out of the collecting game because of the rise in the value of art since the 1970s. In the 1970s, you could still buy emerging artists for affordable amounts of money. If I go around Art Basel now, I see artists who are 1 year out of art school selling for 6 figures. So that's just the world we live in. But finally, my point would be to come back to a point I made at the beginning. What is the role of a museum in this ecology? How close is it supposed to be to this sort of fresh research and experimentation that's happening, as it were, on the ground? I think many people feel, I think perhaps correctly, that there is an early stage life of art which unfolds happily in galleries and nonprofit spaces that are unencumbered by the pressure of having to connect this art to sort of there's less pressure to sort of connect it to the canon, and allow that fermentation to happen in there, and then eventually to pull it into the museum as the sort of last stage of that. So, it's sort of like the Olympics, not everybody who goes to a Saturday soccer game is going to get to the Olympics. So that may be an erroneous proposition. I will say that it's one of the reasons why you've seen some museums create spaces, outside of the museum for that kind of more Kunsthalle style operation. And I'm not at all sure that young artists are well served by going straight into museums. And I think, as you said, that is a conversation we should be having. And I also appreciate that you acknowledged, Yesomi, that art galleries are far from what they used to be. If you look at the book publishing operations, if you look at their practice of often hiring curators, straight out of museums, very high-end curators, the production values, the loans, the sort of thematic exhibitions, there are some who lament that, but the truth is that galleries are also participating in this dialogue in a way that they haven't done before. And we haven't even talked about biennales and art fairs, which are, and of course, and new spaces opening up on the internet, which are also playing this role of sort of making sense of all this preponderance of new art that is coming from all directions today.
I have there's a question here by Stefan Alexandra, and as host, I'm going to modify the question or supplement it a little bit. Stefan's question is: should the museum be less dependent from large internet corporations such as Google, Facebook, Amazon, to spread their work in imagery, books, promo campaigns, fundraising? But I guess I would tag it to a larger, maybe to another question, which is: should museums be so dependent on large corporations per se in general, and whether their dependency actually represents a flaw in terms of the business model that allows museums to really reinvent themselves in truly radical ways?
I might jump in on just this, and I promise I won't speak so much. This question contains a flawed assumption. They're not dependent. I mean, they wish they were, but if you look at the funding pie of a typical museum, we're going to talk about 1 or 2% of their funding, if they're lucky, that comes out of corporate support. Many of the ways in which museums make money from corporations have nothing to do with their curatorial practices. Usually, by far the most money a museum makes from corporations is in rentals. Now, you may have an issue with that they rent out the space to a law firm on a Friday night. I think it's relatively, not dangerous to the mission. In terms of, and I happen to have worked on this frontier for the last couple of decades. The truth is that many corporations have exited relationships from museums because museums were so worried about corporate influence. So all they allowed them to do was to underwrite exhibitions, maybe put their logo on the wall. And corporations wanted that to be a much more partnership-based relationship. So I think that we're somewhat overestimating that relationship. Now, I'm not talking about the fact that, who's actually footing the bill, and trustees and trustee influence is a big conversation to be had about that. But anybody who thinks that corporate dollars are driving museums today, it's just not, that's not the reality on the ground. So, and I think there's a lot of work, a lot of opportunities that are frankly not being taken advantage of. And I'll leave it at that.
Well, just a quick follow-up, and I want Yesomi to come in here. We've only got 3 more minutes, but András, you mentioned about the young artist who's getting a museum show, and you weren't sure whether that was such a good thing, right? And so on, but and I'm not sure either, right? Who's to say what's right or wrong? But I do think, I think of Clement Greenberg's famous line about the umbilical cord of gold, and that is driving and even perverting to a degree what we love about art, the kind of idealism of art, the kind of idealism that actually drove us to discover art and want to pursue it as a path. And I wanted just both of you some comments about that relationship.
You were asking me first. That's great, because that leaves the last word for Yesomi, and she can come up with like the really great answer. So I am increasingly of the view that art and art institutions are not always well served by that kind of pedestalizing. We are still essentially trying to maintain an art system that was created in the 18th century with a lot of intention that was really about separating out art from everyday life, separating art out from science, separating art into its own domain, surrounding and enveloping art in a very critical aesthetic discourse.
Right, and separating out even from the moneyed economy, right?
Exactly, in ways that were actually never truly true, because at the same time there was always a backdoor connection to the. But more importantly, I am not sure that veneration ultimately serves us that well. I would like to see art at the table, artists at the table of the consequential debates in society around technology, science, the economy. And, you know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. I think that we have, in the very process of wanting this sort of idealized image of art, which was never really true. I mean, artists want to survive like we all do and have to, that we have actually to sort of pushed art to the periphery. And so, you know, I think we have to be aware that just as we examine today's assumptions and just as we question today's values, we also have to go back and be critical of what are some of the received values that we all seem to acknowledge that perhaps don't ultimately serve art as well as we might have thought.
Somi?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was just reflecting on the ingenuity of younger artists who have had the fortune to be able to kind of benefit from the market. I'm thinking of the likes of Lauren Halsey, Ibrahim Mahama, Michael Armitage, who have really understood sort of how capital flows in and out of the world, how they can use their capital as sort of up and coming artists to invest in communities, you know, build centers in Ghana, to give back to their own local context. And in that, I think it's this incredible level of savviness and understanding that there are these inextricable sort of relationships that need to be forged in working within the art world between artist and curator and donor and gallerist and museum director. And they're really being very considered about how they're leveraging each of those relationships to kind of further their own interests, whether or not they're political interests or cultural ones or, you know, anything beyond that. So I think there's a lot of hope to be had there. And I think I would like to see more artists kind of like work in that way, and that they are building their own ecosystems that might one day be independent of, you know, how we recognize the art world thus far. And that's really promising. And I think we see that on a number of different levels. And they are also questioning, as I think you mentioned, like really questioning how things are being done and why they're being done in a certain way. And there's a question that was asked previously about what's the relationship to kind of corporations, especially kind of big tech. I think artists are poised right now to really, really kind of, you know, push the needle on how they want to interact with, you know, the tech world, whether or not it's the sort of rise of NFTs or other forms of kind of transactions that we're seeing happen. And that I think is really, really exciting because maybe the answers are not to be found within this curatorial class or the museum director class. Maybe the artists are going to kind of, you know, help us lead the way in some ways in terms of how to kind of broker these many relationships.
That comes to the end. Thank you very much, Somi. Thank you very much, András. What I can say is that it's both your comments are very thought-provoking, and has actually made me think, maybe I should shift my position a little bit, because it rings truer than some of the positions maybe I held prior to our sessions today. So for that, I'm grateful to both of you. Thank you.
Pleasure
Thank
to
you
be
so
here.
much.
Nice rest of your conference. Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much. This concludes our grounding sessions for this morning. And on behalf of us all, I want to extend our deep gratitude to Ken Lum, Yesomi, and András for your generosity and the complexities raised. A huge thanks to all of you, us in this forum for your presence, voices, and excellent questions. So we'll now take a break, relax, and regenerate, and we invite you to reconvene with us at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for our first deep dive panel, Emergent Commitments and Responsibilities of the Cultural Institution. See you back here at 12:30. Thank you, Ken and Somi. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.